Black woman asleep on the plane. Then the captain pushed the intercom and asked, "Is there a fighter pilot on board?" It was a peaceful flight for Nina, a woman who had worked tirelessly to climb the corporate ladder. Exhausted from a long week of meetings and travel, she slipped into a deep sleep, unaware of the growing tension in the air. But everything changed when the calm voice of the captain came over the intercom. "Is there a fighter pilot on board?" he asked, his voice tinged with an urgent unease. As passengers stirred, Nina's eyes remained closed, unaware of the storm that was about to unfold, and the hidden layers of prejudice that would soon surface. Nina Williams had worked hard for everything she had. As an executive at a top tech firm, she had faced constant challenges, but none so fierce as those tied to her skin color. She had often found herself questioning if her accomplishments were truly her own, or if they were seen through a lens of stereotypes and biases. It was her 5th business trip this month. Tired and mentally drained, she finally had a chance to relax as the plane soared above the clouds. She settled into her seat, pulling her jacket tightly around her, and closed her eyes. The hum of the engines lulled her into a deep sleep, the noise of the cabin fading into the background. A few rows in front of Nina, a group of passengers had noticed something unusual. The captain had come over the intercom twice in a brief span of time, his voice growing tenser with each announcement. The flight crew had been whispering in hushed tones. The plane had deviated from its flight path, and the turbulence had been much rougher than expected. Something was wrong. But no one knew exactly what it was. As Nina slept soundly, oblivious to the unease around her, the captain's voice interrupted the peace once again. "Is there a fighter pilot on board?" The question cut through the air like a dagger. It wasn't just the question that caused tension. It was the way he asked it. The way the passengers reacted. The way they turned to each other, eyes wide, searching for someone who could take control of a situation no one understood. The passengers exchanged confused glances. Some whispered nervously, others fidgeted in their seats. Nina, still unaware of the growing chaos, shifted in her seat, adjusting her neck pillow, hoping to fall back into the comforting embrace of sleep. The captain repeated the question, his voice rising with concern. "I need to know, is there a fighter pilot on board?" A few murmurs spread through the cabin. No one seemed to respond. Nina remained asleep, oblivious to the mounting tension. But as she lay there, her peaceful rest was the calm before a storm. In the back of the plane, a few of the flight attendants were huddled together. Their faces were pale with fear. One of the flight attendants, a young woman named Sarah, glanced over at Nina. Her eyes lingered on Nina's face for a moment, then darted to the other passengers. Something was unsettling in the way she looked at Nina. But Sarah wasn't the only one. Other passengers seemed to notice Nina, a black woman asleep amidst the chaos. They glanced at her with suspicion, as though expecting her to be the source of the problem. One man in the middle of the cabin, a white passenger in his mid-40s, stood up abruptly, pointing toward Nina. "It's her, isn't it? She's the reason the captain's asking for a fighter pilot." The accusation hung in the air, thick with the weight of unwarranted prejudice. Nina stirred in her seat, hearing the murmur of voices around her. She opened her eyes groggily, unaware of the conflict simmering beneath the surface. The man who had pointed at her stood frozen in place, his finger still raised. There was no reason for his suspicion. Nothing Nina had done to warrant such an accusation. But the tension in the cabin made it clear that she was now the target of an unspoken blame. The flight attendants exchanged worried glances, one of them hesitating to approach Nina. Sarah, who had earlier locked eyes with Nina, felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She knew she had to act, but part of her was conflicted. She had seen Nina's name tag earlier when she was boarding, Dr. Nina Williams. She was a highly respected corporate executive. But would the others care about that? Would they see her as an innocent woman or as a potential threat? As the flight continued, the situation escalated. The intercom crackled again. "I repeat, is there a fighter pilot on board?" This time it was more than a request, it was a plea. Panic was spreading throughout the cabin like wildfire. The plane had deviated from its course, and turbulence had reached dangerous levels. The passengers were becoming restless, But what was even more alarming was the sudden shift in focus toward Nina. The same man who had pointed at Nina earlier now began to speak louder. I knew something was wrong. It's always people like her. She's probably causing some kind of disturbance. His voice, dripping with unprovoked hostility, cut through the air. Nina was stunned. She had no idea why she was being singled out. All she wanted was to sleep and get home safely. But her peaceful moment was shattered. She stood up, shaking off the confusion and trying to make sense of what was happening. She turned to the man who had accused her. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice calm but laced with disbelief. "What are you talking about?" The man didn't answer. Instead, the whispers grew louder. "That's how they always are, isn't it? Always causing problems." The accusations continued to grow, fueled by the fear and uncertainty of the situation. The weight of racial prejudice bore down on Nina like a heavy burden, and the passengers' focus remained fixed on her. The flight attendants watched the scene unfold, but Sarah was the first to act. She made her way to Nina, standing between her and the increasingly hostile passengers. "Please, ma'am, just sit down." "It's okay," Sarah said, her voice trembling with anxiety. "We need you to remain calm, but it was too late. The damage had been done." Nina's heart raced. How had this escalated so quickly? She felt the eyes of the passengers on her, their suspicion heavy in the air. Just then, the captain's voice came over the intercom once more, this time with an explanation. "We've encountered a malfunction in the navigation system," he said, his voice calm but filled with the urgency of the moment. "There's no need for alarm. We're making course corrections and will land safely soon, but the damage had already been done." The seeds of suspicion had been planted, and the racial tensions were now more evident than ever. Nina realized that, in their eyes, she was no longer a passenger. She was a threat. As the plane descended toward its destination, the tension in the cabin slowly dissipated. The flight crew worked tirelessly to calm the passengers, but the damage to Nina's spirit had already been done. She sat quietly in her seat, staring out the window as the plane touched down. When the flight finally landed, Nina stood up, gathering her things in silence. As she walked down the aisle, she noticed the stares. Some were curious, others judgmental. The man who had accused her avoided her gaze, his face flushed with the embarrassment of his unfounded accusations. Sarah, the flight attendant, came over to Nina as she exited. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "That wasn't right." Nina nodded, though the words didn't bring comfort. She had been targeted not because of anything she had done, but because of who she was. Her skin, her presence, had made her an easy target. Walking through the terminal, Nina felt the weight of the experience pressing down on her. It wasn't just about what had happened on the plane. It was about the world she lived in. A world where people were quick to judge, to blame, to point fingers at someone who didn't look like them, but Nina wasn't going to let this define her. She had worked too hard to let prejudice stand in her way. She would keep pushing forward, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever faced injustice. She would rise above the hate, the racism, and the ignorance. And as the crowd parted around her, Nina realized that, despite everything, she was stronger than ever before. She had been tested, but she had survived. The question now was, would the world ever truly change, or would it continue to judge based on the color of one's skin? Nina didn't have the answer, but she knew one thing for sure. She would keep fighting for a better world, even when the world seemed to be against her.